Have you ever felt invisible, like just another face in the crowd, easily dismissed and quickly forgotten? That's who Clara was, a waitress, a ghost in a bustling city, until one fateful evening. What happens when a woman with nothing to lose confronts a man who believes he owns everything, including her dignity? This isn't a fairy tale. This is the story of a single, blistering moment of defiance that spirals into a life-altering whirlwind of power deception and a gift so extravagant it could either be a dream come true or the beginning of a nightmare. One private island, one shocking secret. Nothing is as it seems. The clatter of cutlery and the low hum of expensive conversations were the soundtrack to Clara's life. At 24, she was a seasoned veteran of the service industry, a graceful dancer in the chaotic ballroom of La Lumière, one of New York City's most exclusive and ostentatiously priced restaurants. Tonight, like every other night, she was a blur of efficiency, her movements economical, her smile a carefully constructed mask of pleasant neutrality. It was a mask she had perfected over 6 years of balancing trays laden with Michelin-starred creations and navigating the fragile egos of the city's elite. Her feet throbbed in her sensible black flats, a dull, persistent ache that radiated up her calves. It was a familiar pain, a constant reminder of the 18-hour days that bled into one another, each a mirror image of the last. She was saving, always saving, for a life she could barely even picture anymore, a life beyond the endless cycle of taking orders and clearing plates, a life where she wasn't just a transient figure in someone else's extravagant evening. The air in La Lumière was thick with the scent of truffle oil, vintage Bordeaux, and entitlement. It was a fragrance that clung to the velvet drapes and seeped into the polished mahogany, a constant reminder of the chasm that separated her world from theirs. Tonight, the atmosphere was particularly charged. The corner booth, the one with the panoramic view of the glittering city skyline, was occupied by him, Alexander Sterling. His name was a murmur on the lips of every staff member, a byword for immense, almost terrifying wealth. He wasn't just rich. He was a titan of industry, a man whose whims could shape markets and topple corporations. His face, chiseled and severe, was a regular feature in the glossy pages of Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. He was in his late 30s, with eyes the color of a stormy sea, and an aura of such intense self-assurance that it bordered on contempt for the world around him. He rarely dined at La Lumière, and when he did, it was an event, a ripple of nervous energy that unsettled the restaurant's carefully orchestrated calm. Clara had been assigned his table, a dubious honor. The potential for a substantial tip was astronomical, but the risk of a cutting remark or a dismissive wave of his hand was equally high. She approached the table with her well-practiced poise, her notepad held at the ready. "Good evening, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice a calm, professional murmur. "May I get you something to drink while you peruse the menu?" He didn't even look at her. His gaze was fixed on the city lights, a glittering tapestry that he probably saw as his own personal kingdom. He was flanked by 2 other men, sycophants in tailored suits who laughed too loudly at his non-existent jokes. A bottle of the Petrus. 2005. He said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that cut through the restaurant's ambient noise. He still hadn't made eye contact. He was speaking to the air, to the space she happened to be occupying. "An excellent choice," Sir Clara replied, her professional smile unwavering. She turned to his companions. "And for you, gentlemen?" They stammered, looking to Sterling for guidance, as if they were incapable of choosing their own beverages. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a silent command that they would drink what he drank. Clara retreated to the sommelier station, her heart a little tighter in her chest. It wasn't just his arrogance. It was the casual, unthinking way he had erased her from the interaction. She was a tool, a means to an end, a faceless servant. She was used to it, but tonight, for some reason, it stung more than usual. She returned with the wine, a bottle that cost more than her monthly rent. She performed the ritual with practiced grace, presenting the bottle, uncorking it with a soft pop, and pouring a small amount for Sterling to taste. He swirled the deep red liquid in his glass, his expression one of bored indifference. He took a sip, his eyes still on the skyline. "It's adequate," he declared, a pronouncement that made the sommelier, a man who worshipped at the altar of fine wine, visibly flinch. The meal progressed in a similar fashion. Sterling ordered for everyone, his tone clipped and dismissive. He sent back his appetizer, a delicate scallop crudo, claiming the scallops were subpar. The kitchen staff scrambled their carefully calibrated rhythm, disrupted by the whims of a man who could probably buy the fishing fleet that had caught the scallops. Clara remained the consummate professional, her movements fluid and unobtrusive, her face a mask of serene efficiency. But beneath the surface a storm was gathering. Each dismissive gesture, each curt command, each time he looked through her as if she were made of glass. A slow-burning anger began to smolder within her. The final straw came with the main course. Sterling had ordered the Wagyu beef, a cut so rare and expensive it was spoken of in hushed tones in the kitchen. It was prepared to perfection, a culinary masterpiece. Clara placed the plate before him, a delicate arrangement of seared beef, truffle-infused potato puree, and a red wine reduction. Sterling picked up his fork and knife, sliced off a small piece, and chewed it with a pensive slowness. The other two men watched him their own meals, forgotten their forks hovering in mid-air. He swallowed, then placed his cutlery down with a soft click. He looked up, and for the first time that evening, his stormy grey eyes met hers. The force of his gaze was startling, a physical impact that made her heart skip a beat. "This is overcooked," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Clara's training, her years of practiced subservience, screamed at her to apologize, to offer to have it remade, to placate him at all costs. But something inside her snapped. The exhaustion, the frustration, the accumulated weight of 1,000 slights and 1,000,000 moments of feeling invisible. It all coalesced into a single point of rebellion. She looked at the perfectly cooked piece of meat, a delicate pink in the center, a beautiful sear on the outside. It was not overcooked. It was perfect. "No, sir," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the hushed reverence that surrounded the table. "It's not." The two sycophants gasped. The restaurant manager, who had been hovering nearby, took a sharp intake of breath. The ambient chatter in the restaurant seemed to dip, as if everyone had suddenly become aware of the drama unfolding at the corner table. Sterling's eyes narrowed. A flicker of something surprise, annoyance, crossed his face. "What did you just say to me?" he asked, his voice now laced with a cold, menacing edge. "I said it's not overcooked, Mr. Sterling." Clara repeated, her chin held high. She could feel the blood pounding in her ears, but she refused to back down. The chef prepared it exactly as it should be, a perfect medium rare. He stared at her, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his lips. It was not a smile of amusement. It was a smile of a man who was about to enjoy crushing something. "And you're a culinary expert now, are you?" he sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I know what a perfectly cooked piece of Wagyu looks like," she retorted, her voice trembling slightly, but her resolve holding firm. "And that, sir, is it." The silence that followed was deafening. The manager was now at her side, his face pale, his hands clasped in a gesture of frantic apology. "Mr. Sterling." "I am so sorry. Please forgive her." "She's new. She doesn't know," he stammered, trying to push Clara away from the table. But Clara stood her ground. She looked Sterling directly in the eye, a silent challenge passing between them. In that moment, she was no longer a waitress, a ghost in his periphery. She was a person, and she would not be dismissed. Sterling's cold smile widened. He leaned back in his chair, a picture of relaxed, absolute power. He picked up his wine glass and took a slow, deliberate sip, his eyes never leaving hers. "Get out," he said, his voice a soft, deadly whisper. "You're fired." The manager's apologies were a frantic, desperate babble in Clara's ear as he all but dragged her away from the table. The eyes of the entire restaurant followed her, a mixture of pity, morbid curiosity, and perhaps for a few of the other service staff, a flicker of vicarious triumph. She had done what they all dreamed of doing. She had talked back. In the cramped, windowless staff room, the manager's frantic energy turned to fury. "Are you insane?" he hissed, his face contorted in a mask of rage and fear. "Do you have any idea who that was?" That was Alexander Sterling. He could buy this restaurant and turn it into his personal shoe closet if he felt like it. He could ruin me. He could ruin you. Clara said nothing. She was numb, a strange, hollow feeling in the pit of her stomach. The adrenaline that had fueled her defiance had faded, leaving behind a cold, stark reality. She had been fired, in the most spectacular public way imaginable. "Get your things and go." The manager snapped, his voice shaking. "You're done here. Don't even think about asking for a reference." She didn't need to be told twice. She moved on autopilot, changing out of her uniform, the crisp white shirt and black trousers that had been her second skin for so long. She packed her meager belongings from her locker, a well-worn copy of 100 Years of Solitude, a faded photograph of her parents, and a small, intricately carved wooden bird, a gift from her grandfather. As she walked out of the restaurant's back alley, the cool night air was a shock to her system. The city sounds, the blare of horns. The distant wail of a siren seemed louder, harsher. She was adrift, cast out from the only world she knew. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and despair. Clara's savings, once a source of pride, now seemed terrifyingly small. She spent hours scouring online job boards, her heart sinking with each rejection, each listing that required a reference she no longer had. The story of her confrontation with Alexander Sterling had spread through the city's restaurant scene like wildfire. She was blacklisted, a pariah. Her small fifth-floor walk-up apartment in a crumbling pre-war building in Queens became her prison. The silence was a stark contrast to the constant noise of La Lumière. It gave her too much time to think, to replay the scene with Sterling over and over in her mind. Had she been foolish, reckless? Had she thrown away her future for a single moment of pride? A week after the incident, a thick cream-colored envelope arrived in her mailbox. It was a startling anomaly among the usual collection of junk mail and bills. Her name and address were handwritten in an elegant, flowing calligraphy. There was no return address. With trembling fingers, She tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of heavy cardstock. On it was a simple typed message. Your presence is requested. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. The Blackwood Building, 57th Street. Penthouse. Beneath the message was a single imperious initial. S. Clara's blood ran cold. The Blackwood Building was Sterling's corporate headquarters, a gleaming black skyscraper that pierced the clouds, a monument to his immense power and wealth. The penthouse was his inner sanctum, a place whispered about in hushed tones, a modern-day fortress from which he ruled his empire. Her first instinct was to throw the letter away, to ignore it, to pretend it had never arrived. What could he possibly want with her? To gloat, to humiliate her further, to serve her with a lawsuit for defamation, for daring to question his palate. But as the day wore on, a different feeling began to take root. Curiosity. A stubborn, defiant curiosity. She had nothing left to lose. He had already taken her job, her livelihood, her reputation. What more could he do? That night she barely slept. She tossed and turned, her mind a whirlwind of fear and a strange, reckless sense of anticipation. She had faced him once. She could do it again. The next morning she stood before the Blackwood Building, a tiny, insignificant figure, dwarfed by the sheer scale of the structure. She wore her best dress, a simple navy blue sheath that she had bought for a long-forgotten special occasion. It was a pathetic attempt at armor, but it was all she had. The lobby was a cathedral of marble and glass, a hushed, intimidating space patrolled by security guards in sharp suits. When she announced her appointment to the receptionist, a woman with a face so perfectly made up, it looked like a mask, she was met with a look of undisguised disbelief. But a quick phone call confirmed her story, and a security guard escorted her to a private elevator. The elevator ascended in a silent, stomach-lurching rush. The doors opened directly into the penthouse, and Clara found herself in a space that defied belief. It was a vast, open-plan apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking 360-degree view of the city. The furniture was sleek and minimalist. The art on the walls was modern and abstract, and the entire space was bathed in a cool, ethereal light. It was less a home and more a statement, a declaration of a man who lived above the world, a god in his own private Olympus. And there he was, standing by the window, his back to her, a silhouette against the city he owned. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored grey suit, his hands clasped behind his back. "Miss Vance?" He said, his voice the same low, gravelly rumble she remembered. He turned to face her, his stormy grey eyes unreadable. "Thank you for coming." Clara's heart was pounding against her ribs, but she met his gaze without flinching. "You didn't give me much of a choice," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. A faint smile touched his lips. "No," he admitted. "I suppose I didn't." He gestured to a pair of plush leather armchairs. "Please sit." She sat perching on the edge of the seat, her back ramrod straight. He sat opposite her, a picture of relaxed, confident power. "I imagine you're wondering why I asked you here." He began, his voice smooth and controlled. "The thought had crossed my mind," she said, a hint of her earlier defiance creeping into her tone. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his gaze intense. "I had you investigated, Miss Vance," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "After our encounter at La Lumière. I wanted to know who this waitress was, who had the audacity to contradict me." Clara's blood ran cold. Investigated. What could he have possibly found? Her life was an open book, a boring, unremarkable story of hard work and quiet desperation. "My private investigators are very thorough," he continued, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "They discovered some interesting things about you." He paused, letting the silence hang in the air, a deliberate, calculated move designed to unnerve her. Clara's mind raced. What could he know her parents' death in a car accident when she was 18? Her struggle to pay for her mother's medical bills before she passed. The mountain of debt she was still trying to climb. "They discovered that you are not, in fact, just a waitress," he said, his voice a soft, triumphant purr. "They discovered that you are a classically trained chef." Clara's carefully constructed composure crumbled. She stared at him, her mouth agape, her heart hammering against her ribs. How could he know that it was a secret she had buried so deep she had almost forgotten it herself? "You graduated at the top of your class from the Culinary Institute of America," he continued, his voice relentless. "You had a promising career ahead of you. You were a rising star. And then you vanished. You disappeared from the culinary world and reappeared as a waitress at a second-rate Italian restaurant in Brooklyn, before eventually clawing your way up to La Lumiere." He leaned back in his chair, a smug, satisfied look on his face. "The question is, Miss Vance," he said, his voice a low, seductive whisper. Why, Clara was speechless. Her past, her secret shame, her broken dreams, all laid bare before the man who had fired her, the man she despised. The room seemed to spin the city skyline, blurring into a kaleidoscope of light and color. Her carefully constructed world, her life of quiet anonymity had been shattered. And as she looked into the stormy, unreadable eyes of Alexander Sterling, she had the terrifying premonition that her life was about to be turned upside down in a way she could never have imagined. The silence in the penthouse stretched thick and heavy with unspoken words. Clara felt exposed, as if he had peeled back the layers of her carefully constructed persona and laid bare the raw, vulnerable person beneath. The secret she had guarded so fiercely, the dream she had been forced to abandon, was now a weapon in his hands. How did you find that out?" she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. A ghost of a smile played on Sterling's lips. "As I said, Miss Vance, I am a very thorough man. Money can buy many things. Information is one of them." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "But you haven't answered my question. Why did you throw it all away? A talent like yours, it's a crime to let it go to waste." The question hung in the air, a painful reminder of a life she had once envisioned. The passion, the ambition, the joy she had found in the heat of the kitchen, it all came rushing back, a bittersweet ache in her chest. She took a deep breath, the air in the sterile, opulent room feeling thin and inadequate. She had two choices. She could lie, she could deflect, she could try to maintain the wall she had built around herself, or she could tell him the truth, and for some reason, looking into his intense, unyielding eyes, she felt that a lie would be pointless. He would see right through it. "My father," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "He owned a small restaurant, a bistro in a little town upstate. It was his life's work. My mother was the heart of the place, the warm, welcoming face that greeted every customer. I grew up in that kitchen. It was my playground, my school, my sanctuary." She paused, the memories washing over her. "I went to culinary school to make him proud, to learn the techniques he never had the chance to master. I wanted to come back and help him turn his little bistro into something special." Her voice cracked, and she had to stop to swallow the lump that had formed in her throat. Sterling remained silent, his expression unreadable, but he was listening. She could feel the weight of his attention, a focused, unnerving intensity. The day I graduated, she continued, her voice trembling slightly. I got a call. There had been an accident. A drunk driver. My parents. They were both gone. The silence that followed was profound. Even the city outside seemed to have fallen quiet. Clara stared at her hands, clasped tightly in her lap, unable to meet his gaze. The restaurant was heavily in debt, she said, her voice a monotone. My father had taken out a second mortgage to pay for my tuition. There were hospital bills. It was a mess. I had to sell everything. The restaurant, the house, everything they had worked for. It wasn't enough. I was left with a mountain of debt, a debt I'm still paying off. She finally looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. So I became a waitress. It was a job, a way to make money, a way to survive. The culinary world, it was too painful. It was a reminder of everything I had lost. She expected him to say something, to offer a platitude, a hollow expression of sympathy, but he remained silent, his gaze fixed on her face, a strange, thoughtful expression in his eyes. "That's why you knew the Wagyu was cooked perfectly," he said, his voice a soft murmur. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. She nodded, a single jerky movement. "I spent a year apprenticing under a chef who was obsessed with Japanese beef. I know more about Wagyu than most people know about their own families." He leaned back in his chair, a slow, contemplative look on his face. He seemed to be reassessing her, seeing her in a new light. The silence stretched again, but this time it was different. It was less a weapon and more a space for thought, for consideration. "I have a proposition for you, Miss Vance," he said at last, his voice taking on a business-like tone. Clara's heart skipped a beat. A proposition? What could he possibly want from her? "I am a man who appreciates talent," he said, his voice smooth and persuasive. "And you, Miss Vance, are exceptionally talented. It's a waste for you to be serving overpriced wine to people who can't tell the difference between a Bordeaux and a Burgundy." He stood up and walked over to the window, his back to her once again. "I own a number of properties around the world. One of them is a private island in the Caribbean. It's a place I use for discreet business meetings, for entertaining important clients. It has a fully equipped professional kitchen, a staff, everything one would expect from a luxury resort." He turned to face her, a strange, intense look in his eyes. "The island's current chef is uninspired. He lacks passion, creativity. He cooks by the numbers. I, on the other hand, have a palate that is difficult to please, as you have so astutely pointed out." A faint, self-deprecating smile touched his lips. "I want you to be my personal chef, Miss Vance. You would live on the island. You would have complete creative control over the kitchen. You would have an unlimited budget. You would want for nothing." Clara stared at him, dumbfounded. Was he serious? A private island? Her own kitchen? An unlimited budget. It was a fantasy, a fairy tale, a dream so outlandish it bordered on the absurd. And in return she asked, her voice skeptical, "What do you get out of it?" "I get to eat well," he said simply. "And I get the satisfaction of knowing that a talent like yours is not being wasted." He walked over to his desk, a vast expanse of polished black marble. He picked up a folder and handed it to her. "This is a contract," he said. "It outlines the terms of our arrangement. A 5-year contract, a salary that will allow you to pay off your debts within the first 6 months. A non-disclosure agreement, of course. My privacy is paramount." Clara opened the folder with trembling hands. The numbers on the page were staggering sums of money she had never imagined she would see in her lifetime. It was a golden ticket, a way out of the hole she had been digging herself out of for the past 6 years. But it was also a gilded cage, a 5-year contract, a non-disclosure agreement. She would be his employee, living on his island, subject to his whims. She would be trading one form of servitude for another, albeit a much more luxurious one. "And what if I say no?" she asked, her voice a whisper. He smiled a cold, confident smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "You won't," he said, his voice a low, certain purr. "You're a survivor, Miss Vance, and this is an opportunity you can't afford to refuse." He was right, of course. He had her backed into a corner. He had stripped away her defenses, exposed her weaknesses, and then offered her a deal that was impossible to resist. It was a masterful, ruthless move, a display of power that was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. She looked at the contract in her hands, then at the man standing before her, a titan of industry, a man who moved the world with the flick of a wrist. He was arrogant, ruthless, and manipulative, but he had also truly seen her in a way that no one else had in a very long time. "I have one condition," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "Oh, I want it in writing," she said, her voice firm. "In the contract. That you will never again question my professional judgment in the kitchen. If I say a dish is perfect, it's perfect. No arguments, no sending it back, no subpar scallops." A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, a smile that transformed his severe features, making him look younger, almost charming. He chuckled a low, rumbling sound that surprised her. "Miss Vance," he said, extending his hand. "You have yourself a deal." She took his hand, her small, calloused hand engulfed in his large, powerful one. The contact sent a strange jolt of electricity through her, a feeling that was both alarming and strangely exciting. As she signed the contract, her hand trembling slightly, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was signing away more than just her time. She was signing away a piece of herself, stepping into a world of unimaginable wealth and power, a world from which she might never be able to escape. She had stood up to the rude billionaire, and in a strange, twisted turn of events, he had gifted her a private island. But as she walked out of the Blackwood building and back into the harsh reality of her own life, she couldn't help but wonder if the island was a gift or a prison, and if Alexander Sterling was her savior or her captor. The journey to the island was a surreal experience, a jarring transition from the gritty reality of her queen's apartment to a world of unimaginable luxury. A black car, silent and sleek, had collected her before dawn. It had transported her to a private airfield where a Gulfstream G650 Sterling's personal jet awaited. The flight was a blur of champagne leather seats and a deferential flight attendant who addressed her as Ms. Vance. They landed on a tiny airstrip carved into the lush green landscape of a small jewel-like island in the heart of the Caribbean. The air that greeted her as she stepped off the plane was warm and thick with the scent of salt and tropical flowers, a stark contrast to the exhaust-choked air of New York City. A man in a crisp white uniform was waiting for her. He introduced himself as Marcus, the island's manager, a man with a warm smile and kind eyes that seemed out of place in Sterling's world of sharp edges and cold transactions. "Welcome to Isla de Sombra." "Miss Vance," he said, his voice a gentle Caribbean lilt. "The island of shadows." The name sent a small, involuntary shiver down her spine. It was a strangely ominous name for such a beautiful place. The main residence was a stunning piece of modern architecture, a series of interconnected villas with white walls, dark wood accents, and vast expanses of glass that blurred the line between inside and out. It was perched on a cliff overlooking a turquoise bay, a private paradise that was both breathtakingly beautiful and strangely isolating. Her own villa was a short walk from the main house, a smaller but equally luxurious version with its own private plunge pool and a terrace that offered a panoramic view of the ocean. It was more opulent than any place she had ever stayed in a palace compared to her cramped apartment. But it was also a gilded cage, a beautiful prison on an island owned by a man she both feared and was inexplicably drawn to. The kitchen was her sanctuary. It was a chef's dream, a vast, state-of-the-art space with gleaming stainless steel surfaces, a walk-in pantry stocked with the finest ingredients from around the world, and every piece of culinary equipment she could possibly imagine. It was a space designed for creation, for passion, for art. For the first few weeks, Clara threw herself into her work. It was a way to distract herself from the strangeness of her new life, from the unsettling feeling of being constantly watched, constantly under the microscope of Alexander Sterling's expectations. He was not on the island when she arrived, and Marcus was vague about his schedule. Mr. Sterling's movements are unpredictable, was all he would say. So Clara cooked. She experimented. She rediscovered the passion that had been dormant for so long. She created elaborate tasting menus, fusion dishes that blended Caribbean flavors with classical French techniques, simple, elegant meals that celebrated the freshness of the local seafood and produce. She cooked for the staff, a small, discreet team of housekeepers, gardeners, and security personnel. They were a quiet, reserved group, polite and professional, but they kept their distance. She learned that they were all bound by the same ironclad non-disclosure agreements she had signed. They were all inhabitants of Sterling's secret world. One evening, as she was putting the finishing touches on a delicate passion fruit soufflé, Marcus entered the kitchen. "Mr. Sterling will be arriving tomorrow," he announced, his voice neutral. "He will be here for a week. He has a guest." A guest? The word sent a strange, unwelcome pang of something through her. Jealousy, curiosity. She told herself it was ridiculous. She was his employee, nothing more. His personal life was none of her business, but she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The next day, a sleek white helicopter descended from the sky, landing on the helipad near the main house. Clara watched from the kitchen window as Sterling emerged looking every bit the master of his domain in a crisp linen shirt and white trousers. And then she saw his guest, a woman, tall, impossibly beautiful with long, flowing blonde hair and a supermodel's figure. She was dressed in a flowing white dress that billowed in the sea breeze, and she clung to Sterling's arm, her laughter echoing across the manicured lawns. Clara's heart sank. This was the reality of her situation. She was the help. She was here to cook for him and his beautiful, glamorous companions. That night, she prepared a special 7-course tasting menu, a culinary symphony designed to impress, to prove her worth. Each dish was a masterpiece, a testament to her talent, her passion, her art. She sent the first course out with one of the servers, a delicate amuse-bouche of chilled cucumber soup with a hint of mint and lime. A few minutes later, the server returned, his face pale. "Mr. Sterling has a message for the chef," he said, his voice trembling slightly. Clara's heart pounded in her chest. Had she failed? Had her cooking not met his exacting standards? He says, "The soup is too cold," the server stammered. Clara stared at him incredulous. Too cold? It was a chilled soup. It was supposed to be cold. A slow, burning anger began to smolder within her. It was the Wagyu all over again. The casual, arrogant dismissal of her expertise. The blatant disregard for their agreement. She untied her apron, her movements sharp and jerky. "Where is he?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "They are dining on the terrace," Miss Vance, the server, whispered, his eyes wide with alarm. She strode out of the kitchen, her chef's whites a stark contrast to the soft, romantic lighting of the terrace. Sterling and his beautiful companion were seated at a table overlooking the ocean, a picture of perfect romantic bliss. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice cutting through the soft music that was playing in the background. He looked up, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. The woman beside him looked at Clara with a mixture of confusion and disdain, as if she were a bug that had crawled out from under a rock. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice cold and clipped. "This is a private dinner. We have a contract, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice shaking with barely suppressed rage. "A contract that you are currently violating." He raised an eyebrow, a look of feigned innocence on his face. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "My soup," she said, her voice rising. "You said it was too cold. It's a chilled soup. It is supposed to be cold. You agreed not to question my professional judgment." The woman beside him giggled, a high, tinkling sound that grated on Clara's nerves. "Darling," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "The waitress is having a little tantrum." Clara's gaze snapped to the woman. "I am not a waitress," she said, her voice a low, fierce growl. "I am a chef. And you are a guest in my kitchen." The woman's jaw dropped. Sterling's eyes narrowed, a dangerous glint in their stormy depths. "That's enough, Miss Vance," he said, his voice a low, menacing command. "Go back to the kitchen." "No," she said, her chin held high. "Not until you apologize." The silence that followed was electric. The sea breeze seemed to hold its breath. The waves crashing against the rocks below seemed to fall silent. Sterling stared at her, a strange, unreadable expression on his face. It was a mixture of anger, surprise, and something else. Something she couldn't quite decipher. Respect, admiration. He slowly pushed back his chair and stood up, a towering, intimidating figure in the moonlight. He walked towards her, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. He stopped just a few inches from her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. She could smell his cologne, a subtle, expensive scent of sandalwood and citrus. "You have 5 seconds," he said, his voice a low, dangerous whisper, "to turn around and walk back to that kitchen before I have you removed from this island. Permanently." Clara's heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic, terrified bird trapped in a cage. But she refused to back down. She had come too far, sacrificed too much to be cowed by him now. She met his gaze without flinching, her own eyes blazing with a defiant fire. "Then I guess you'll have to have me removed," she said, her voice a surprisingly steady whisper. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. It was the same smile he had given her in the restaurant, the smile of a man who was about to enjoy crushing something. But this time there was something different in his eyes, a flicker of something that looked almost like desire. He leaned in closer, his lips just inches from her ear. "You are playing a very dangerous game, Miss Vance," He whispered, his voice a low, seductive purr. And in that moment, as she stood on the moonlit terrace of a private island in the middle of nowhere, facing down the most powerful, ruthless man she had ever met, Clara knew that this was more than just a job. It was a battle of wills, a dangerous, intoxicating dance of power and passion. And she had no idea how it was going to end. The tension on the terrace was a palpable thing, a shimmering electric field that seemed to crackle between them. The beautiful blonde, whose name Clara still didn't know and didn't care to watch the exchange with a mixture of shock and outrage, her perfectly sculpted mouth agape. Sterling's threat hung in the air, a cold, hard promise. But Clara held her ground, her defiance a shield against the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. She had been removed from a job before. The thought no longer held the same terror it once did. In a strange way, his ultimatum was liberating. She met his intense, stormy gaze and saw something flicker in their depths. The anger was still there, but it was now overlaid with a grudging respect, a hint of something she couldn't yet name. He didn't move. He just stared at her as if trying to solve a complex puzzle. The seconds ticked by, each one a small eternity. Finally, to her utter astonishment, he took a step back, a single, almost imperceptible retreat, but it felt like a seismic shift in the balance of power. He turned to his companion, his expression now cool and dismissive. "Veronica," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth, "I think you should go inside. The evening has become tiresome." Veronica stared at him, her face a mask of disbelief. "But Alex, the waitress." "She is not a waitress," he corrected, his voice sharp. "She is my chef, and her name is Miss Vance." He gave her a look that was both a command and a dismissal. "Go." With a huff of indignant fury, Veronica shot Clara a look of pure venom and flounced back into the villa, the sound of her heels clicking angrily on the stone tiles. Now they were alone, the only sounds the rhythmic crash of the waves below and the soft rustle of palm fronds in the night breeze. Sterling turned his attention back to Clara. The anger in his eyes had subsided, replaced by a weary, almost contemplative look. "You are," he said, his voice a low murmur, "without a doubt, the most infuriating woman I have ever met." "What?" "The feeling is mutual," she retorted, though her voice lacked its earlier fire. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, leaving her feeling shaky and drained. He actually chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from deep within his chest. "I suppose I deserved that." He walked over to the edge of the terrace and leaned against the railing, his gaze fixed on the moonlit sea. "The soup was fine, of course," he admitted, not looking at her. "It was exquisite, as is everything you create." Clara remained silent, unsure of how to respond to this unexpected concession. "Veronica is a distraction," he continued, his voice taking on a thoughtful, almost confessional tone. "A beautiful, mindless distraction. The world I live in, Miss Vance, it is filled with people like her. People who want something from me. My money, my power, my name. They tell me what they think I want to hear. They laugh at my jokes. They agree with my opinions. They flatter my ego. It's a relentless, exhausting performance." He turned to face her, his expression serious. "And then there's you, the one person in my employ who is not afraid to tell me I'm wrong. The one person who challenges me, who pushes back, who demands respect." He took a step towards her, his gaze intense. "That night at La Lumière, you were right. The Wagyu was perfect. I was in a foul mood. I had just closed a particularly brutal deal, one that left a bad taste in my mouth. I took it out on you. It was unbecoming. Clara was stunned into silence. An apology. A genuine heartfelt apology from Alexander Sterling. It was the last thing she had expected. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "Because," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate murmur, "I think we need to renegotiate the terms of our arrangement." He was standing very close to her, now his presence overwhelming her senses. She could see the flecks of silver in his stormy grey eyes, the faint lines of exhaustion around them. He was not just a billionaire, a titan of industry. He was a man, a complex, flawed, and surprisingly vulnerable man. "What do you mean?" she asked, her heart beginning to pound a new unfamiliar rhythm. "I don't just want you to be my chef, Clara," he said, using her first name for the first time. The sound of it on his lips was both startling and strangely intimate. "I want more." He reached out and gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was feather-light, but it sent a jolt of electricity through her, a warmth that spread through her veins like wildfire. "I want you to be my companion," he said, his voice a low, seductive whisper. "Not like Veronica. Not a mindless distraction. A partner. Someone I can talk to. Someone who will be honest with me. Someone who will challenge me." Clara's mind was reeling. A companion. A partner. What was he asking for? Was this part of the job description? A clause hidden in the fine print of her contract. "I'm not for sale, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice trembling slightly, but her resolve holding firm. "I know," he said, his voice soft. "That's what makes you so valuable." He smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed his face, making him look almost boyish. "And please, call me Alex." He leaned in closer, his lips just inches from hers. "This island, Clara, it's a lonely place. I built it as a sanctuary, a refuge from the world. But a sanctuary is meaningless if you have no one to share it with." His gaze dropped to her lips, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought he was going to kiss her. The thought was both terrifying and thrilling, a dangerous, forbidden desire that she had been trying to suppress since the day she had signed his contract. But he didn't kiss her. He pulled back, a flicker of something, regret, restraint in his eyes. "Think about it," he said, his voice a low, husky whisper. "No contracts, no obligations, just an invitation." He turned and walked away, leaving her alone on the moonlit terrace, her heart pounding her mind, a whirlwind of confusion and a strange, burgeoning hope. The next morning, Veronica was gone. There was no explanation, no fanfare. She had simply vanished, as if she had never been there at all. Clara spent the day in a daze, her thoughts consumed by Alex's proposition. Was it a genuine offer of companionship, or just another one of his masterful manipulations? Could she trust him? Could she allow herself to feel anything for this powerful and energetic man who had turned her life upside down? That evening, she prepared a simple meal, a rustic, home-style dinner of roasted chicken root vegetables and a simple green salad. It was a meal from the heart, a meal that spoke of comfort of home, of the little bistro her parents had owned. She didn't send it out with a server. She carried the tray to the main villa herself. She found Alex in his study, a vast book-lined room with a roaring fireplace and a view of the stormy sea. He was sitting in a leather armchair, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring into the flames. He looked up as she entered, a look of surprise on his face. "I thought we could eat together," she said, her voice a little shy, a little uncertain. A slow smile spread across his face, a smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners and banishing the shadows that so often lurked there. "I would like that very much, Clara," he said, his voice soft. They ate in comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the distant roar of the ocean. It was a simple, unassuming meal, but it felt more intimate, more meaningful than any of the elaborate culinary creations she had prepared for him before. After dinner, he stood up and walked over to a large antique globe that stood in the corner of the room. "You asked me once what I get out of our arrangement," he said, his voice a low murmur. "You thought I hired you simply because I wanted to eat well." He spun the globe, a blur of continents and oceans. "That was part of it, of course, but it wasn't the main reason." He stopped the globe with his finger, his nail resting on a tiny, insignificant speck in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. "There is another island, Clara," he said, his voice taking on a strange, almost reverent tone. "A real island. Not a manufactured paradise like this one. A place that is what and untamed and beautiful." He looked at her, his eyes filled with an emotion she couldn't quite decipher. "It's called Motu Tane," he said, his voice a whisper. "It's in the Cook Islands. It belonged to a man named Francois Nars, a famous makeup artist and photographer. He built a sanctuary there, a place of peace and beauty." He paused, a look of profound sadness in his eyes. "My mother, she loved his work. She dreamed of going there one day. She had a picture of it on her bedside table. It was her symbol of hope, of a life she never got to live." Clara's heart ached for him. She was beginning to see the man behind the mask, the lonely boy who had lost his mother, the man who had built a fortress of wealth and power to protect himself from the pain of the world. "What happened to her?" she asked, her voice gentle. He was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the tiny speck on the globe. "She was a lot like you," he said at last, his voice thick with emotion. "She was a fighter. She was proud. She refused to be a victim." He took a deep breath as if steeling himself for a painful confession. "My father, he was not a good man. He was cruel and controlling and abusive. My mother tried to leave him to take me with her, but he had money and power, and he made sure she couldn't. He broke her spirit piece by piece." He looked at Clara, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "She died when I was 16. The doctors said it was an aneurysm. But I know the truth. She died of a broken heart." The confession hung in the air between them, a raw, painful truth that explained so much. His arrogance, his need for control, his fear of vulnerability. It was all a defense mechanism, a suit of armor he had built around himself to keep from getting hurt. "After my father died," he continued, his voice a low, ragged whisper, "I used the inheritance he left me to destroy everything he had built. I bought his company, and I dismantled it piece by piece. And then I started building my own empire, an empire built on my own terms." He walked back to her, his gaze intense, his eyes filled with a raw, desperate vulnerability. "When I saw you in that restaurant, Clara, when you stood up to me, I didn't see a waitress. I saw her. I saw my mother's spirit, her fire, her defiance. And I knew I couldn't let that fire be extinguished." He reached out and took her hands in his grip firm and sure. I didn't hire you to be my chef, Clara. I hired you to save you, to give you the life that she never had, the life you deserve." Tears streamed down Clara's face, tears of sorrow for the mother he had lost, tears of understanding for the man he had become, tears of a strange, overwhelming joy for the connection they had forged in this unlikely paradise. He gently wiped her tears with his thumb, his touch sending a shiver through her. "The island, Clara," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Motutane. I bought it. It's yours." Clara stared at him, her mind unable to process his words. Her own island, a real island, a symbol of hope, of freedom, of a new beginning. I don't know what to say," she stammered. Her voice choked with emotion. "You don't have to say anything," he whispered, his gaze dropping to her lips. And this time, he didn't pull back. He leaned in and kissed her a soft, tender kiss that was filled with all the unspoken words, all the shared pain, all the burgeoning hope that had brought them to this moment. It was not the kiss of a billionaire and his employee. It was the kiss of two lonely souls who had found each other in the most unexpected of circumstances, two broken people who together might just be able to make each other whole. As she kissed him back, the last of her reservations, her fears, her doubts melted away. She was no longer a waitress, a chef, a prisoner in a gilded cage. She was a woman who had found her voice, her strength, and in the most unlikely of places her love. The storm had passed, the shadows had receded, and on a private island in the middle of the sea, under the watchful gaze of 1,000,000,000 stars, a new day was dawning. So a moment of defiance in a high-end restaurant blossomed into a tale of healing trust and a love that transcended the vast gulf of wealth and power. Clara, the waitress who refused to be invisible, didn't just find a paradise in Motutane. She found a partner in Alex, a man who saw beyond her uniform to the strength and talent within. And Alex, the billionaire, trapped in his own lonely empire, found in Clara a truth and an honesty that no amount of money could buy. Theirs is a story that reminds us that sometimes the most unexpected connections are forged in the fires of conflict, and that true wealth lies not in what we own, but in the hearts we are brave enough to open. What did you think of Clara's incredible journey? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed the story. Share it with someone who needs a dose of drama and hope, and subscribe for more unforgettable real-life dramas.